The anecdote I am about to recount appears in Tournefort's travels in the Levant and may help shed some light on those curious tales we hear of vampires. "We were witnesses," writes the author, "to a most peculiar scene on the island of Mykonos, one that revolved around one of those dead men who, it is said, are seen again walking abroad after their burial. Northerners call them vampires, the Greeks know them as Broucolaques. The man in question was a local peasant from Mykonos, naturally sullen, quarrelsome by temperament. That, I should note, is not an uncommon trait among such cases. He was killed in the countryside, though no one could say by whom or under what circumstances. 2 days after he'd been laid to rest in a chapel within the town, word spread that he'd been seen at night, striding about with long, brisk steps, slipping into houses, knocking over furniture, extinguishing lamps, embracing people from behind, and 1,000 mischievous tricks besides. At first the townsfolk laughed it off, but matters turned grave when even the most respectable citizens began to complain. The papas, the Greek priests, confirmed the reports, and no doubt they spoke sincerely. Naturally, masses were said, and yet the peasant persisted in his nocturnal antics, wholly unreformed. After several gatherings of the town's elders, priests and monks, they resolved, according to some ancient rite, though no one seemed quite sure of its origins, that they must wait 9 days after the burial. On the 10th day, a solemn mass was said in the chapel where the body lay, meant to expel whatever demon had taken up residence in the corpse. Once the mass was over, the grave was opened. They removed the heart. The body reeked so foully that incense had to be burned. But the smoke, mingling with the stench, only made the air worse, and it began to overheat the imaginations of these poor people. Someone swore they saw a thick smoke rising from the corpse. We, who were present the entire time, did not dare say aloud that it was only the incense. Several of those present swore that the poor man's blood was still bright red. Others insisted the body was warm to the touch. Clear proof, they concluded, that the dead man was in the wrong for not being properly dead, or rather that he had allowed himself to be reanimated by the devil. That precisely is what they imagine a Broucolaque to be. And now the word rang out from every mouth like a battle cry. A crowd arrived in haste, loudly declaring that they'd noticed the body wasn't stiff at all when it was brought in from the countryside for burial, and so obviously it was a Broucolaque. That was the chorus, endlessly repeated. When we were asked what we believed about the deceased, we replied that we believed him to be perfectly dead, and that the so-called crimson blood, upon closer inspection, was nothing but a noisome, stagnant sludge. We did our best to calm their agitated minds, if not to cure them entirely, by explaining the so-called vapours and the supposed warmth of the corpse. But despite all our reasoning, it was decided that the dead man's heart must be burned. After this execution, he was no more docile than before, and in fact the commotion only worsened. He was accused of beating people at night, of bursting through doors, shattering windows, tearing clothes, and emptying pitchers and wine bottles. He was, it seemed, a very thirsty corpse. I believe the only house he spared was the one belonging to the consul, where we ourselves were staying. The entire town had lost its head. Even the most rational minds seemed just as affected as the rest. It was a true illness of the brain, no less dangerous than madness or delirium. One saw entire families abandon their homes, dragging their bedrolls across the city to camp out in the town square overnight. Everyone claimed to have suffered some new insult, and even the most clear-headed retreated to the countryside. The citizens most zealous for the public good were convinced that the entire affair had failed for want of one essential detail. The Mass, they insisted, should not have been celebrated before removing the dead man's heart. Had this precaution been taken, they argued, the devil would certainly have been caught off guard, and surely wouldn't have dared return. But since the Mass had been said first, he'd had ample time to flee and saunter back at his leisure. Despite all these reasonings, they found themselves in no better position than on the first day. Meetings were held morning and night. Processions wound through the streets for 3 days and 3 nights. The papas were compelled to fast. One saw them rushing from house to house, holy water sprinkler in hand, dousing doorways and brushing them clean with blessed water. They even filled the poor Broucolaque's mouth with it. In the grip of such universal delusion, we chose to say nothing at all. Not only would we have been called fools, but infidels. After all, how does one bring an entire people back to reason? Each morning a new comedy was staged for us. Breathless accounts of the night's fresh horrors, all laid at the feet of that nocturnal phantom. He was even accused of having committed the most abominable sins. Still, we persisted in telling the city officials that, in our country, the first thing we would do in such a case would be to set a watch through the night, to observe what was really happening. At long last, they agreed, and soon enough a few vagrants were arrested. Men who had most certainly played a part in the mischief. But they were released too soon. 2 nights later, making up for the fasting they'd endured in prison, they resumed their nocturnal rounds, draining wine jugs from the cellars of those foolish enough to have abandoned their homes. And so, once again, the people had no recourse but prayer. One day, as they were reciting certain prayers, having driven I don't know how many unsheathed swords into the grave of that corpse which they were now digging up 3 or 4 times a day, depending on the whim of whoever happened to pass by, an Albanian who happened to be present suddenly declared, in the tone of a learned man, that in such matters it was utterly absurd to use the swords of Christians. "Don't you see, poor fools," he said, "that the hilt of these swords, crossing with the guard, forms a crucifix and prevents the devil from escaping the body? Why not use Turkish sabres instead?" This clever counsel was of no use. The Broucolaque showed no sign of being more tractable, and the people, not knowing which saint to turn to, were on the verge of despair, when suddenly, as though the thought had passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire, the entire town cried out with one voice that the Broucolaque must be burned whole. That, they said, would stop the devil once and for all from creeping back into him. Better to go to such extremes than to let the island become deserted. And indeed, some families had already begun packing their belongings, ready to settle elsewhere. So, by order of the town magistrates, the Broucolaque was carried to the far end of the island of St. George, where a great pyre had been prepared, coated with tar, lest the wood, dry though it was, should fail to catch quickly enough. The remains of that wretched corpse were thrown upon it and reduced to ashes in short order. It was the 1st day of January, in the year 1701. From that moment on, there were no more complaints about the Broucolaque. People merely said that the devil had been thoroughly outwitted this time, and a few comic songs were written to mock him for it.